Hey everybody, Brian, we're here in Kaufman. There's some nitwits up here in Kaufman, and they found out that Glenn had invited us up, and they started jammering about how we're Antifa, and we're going to come up and do something destructive. And that is so preposterous, so I have a sense of humor. So I wrote on Facebook, and I wish I hadn't written this, I'm going to put on my best arson clothes.
Oh boy.
Right. I don't have arson in clothes. Nobody has arson in clothes. Right? So, unfortunately, the idiots, frankly, decided that this was a sincere threat. Which is silly. So we gotten some threats, and there's some people probably going to show up, and they're going to be all gunned up. Meanwhile, we got papers. So there's a whole bunch of, hey, why don't you just go back where you came from? And that hasn't changed. Right, so people say, if you take down the monuments, you'll repeat our history. But most of the people who say that are repeating our history. So here's a speech. House of Representatives, April 5th, 1860. So this was a month and a day after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated and the first national flag of the Confederacy had been adopted by the Confederate Congress down in Mississippi. So 7, I think, of the southern states had seceded. 4 of them hadn't yet because they were waiting for Fort Sumter. So there were still Democrats, including some southern Democrats, on the floor of the House. So the Honorable Owen Lovejoy of Illinois rose to give an anti-slavery speech. And he said that there have been 3 defenses of slavery. Black people aren't smart enough to be free. It's like, that doesn't mean that you get to own and exploit them. We're going to Christianize them. It's like, how do you Christianize people when you deny them all family and decency? And third, it's in the Constitution. It's like, well, first, it isn't. And second, if it were, that's an embarrassment. So anyway, he's talking through here. The principle of enslaving human beings because they are inferior is this. If a man is crippled, trip him up. If he's old and weak and bowed with the weight of years, strike him, for he cannot strike back. If idiotic, take advantage of him, and if a child, deceive him. This, sir, is the doctrine of Democrats, and the doctrine of devils as well, and there's no place in the universe outside the 5 points of hell in the Democratic Party where the practice and prevalence of such doctrines would not be a disgrace. Laughter. If the strong of the earth are to enslave the weak here, it would justify angels in enslaving men because they're superior, and archangels in turn would be justified in subjugating those who are inferior in intellect and position, and ultimately it would transform Jehovah into an infinite juggernaut rolling the huge wheels of his omnipotence. Right, so his contention there is that slavery violates the overwhelming natural order according to which human beings are free, that God allows us a scope of free action. All right, Mr. Lovejoy had advanced into the area and occupied the space fronting the Democratic benches. Mr. Pryor, advancing from the Democratic side of the House toward the area Mr. Lovejoy stood, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lovejoy, shall not approach this side of the House, shaking his fists and talking in the way he's talked. It's bad enough to be compelled to sit here and hear him utter his treasonable and insulting language, but he shall not, sir. It's emphasized in the congressional record. He shall not, sir, come upon this side of the House, shaking his fist in our faces. Mr. Farnsworth, it's not for the gentleman to say what is treason and what is not. Mr. Potter, we listened to gentlemen upon the other side for 8 weeks when they denounced the members upon this side with violent and offensive language. We listened to them quietly and heard them through, and now, sir, this side shall be heard, let the consequences be what they may. Mr. Pryor, the guy who was interrupting, the point I make is this: the chair will receive no motion here, no gentleman, until members resume their seats and order is restored in the hall. So you have to try to imagine how loud and upsetting things were. And bear in mind that at this point, people had been actually carrying Bowie knives and braces of pistols into the Senate and the House of Representatives for years. A couple of years earlier, some extremely angry young man from South Carolina, a senator from down there, had actually assaulted Senator Charles Sumner, an abolitionist from Maine, beat him with a big heavy cane to within an inch of his life. The guy was in a coma for weeks, and he did not ever quite recover. So, try to imagine Mr. Pryor advancing from the Democratic side of the House, and then the chairman is, I'm not doing anything until everybody takes their seat and order is restored in the hall. People might have been just about brandishing weapons at this point in the House of Representatives of the United States of America. All right, Mr. Cox, I rise to a point of order. I insist the gentleman from Illinois shall speak from his seat. Right, so they just wanted Lovejoy to go back to his seat. Mr. Pryor, that's the point I make. Let the gentleman speak from his seat and say all under the rules he is entitled to say, but sir, he shall not come upon this side, shaking his fist in our faces and talking in the style he's talked. He thinks he owns part of the United States House of Representatives. He shall not come here gesticulating in a menacing and ruffianly manner. You know, I wish we had our language back. I like that, ruffianly manner. Mr. Potter replied, you're doing the same thing. You've heard this, right? When people are having all of their, screaming matches at all these debates, you should do this. Well, you're doing the same thing. Get out of my face. You get out of my face. This is just the old-fashioned way of saying the same thing. Chairman, gentlemen will resume their seats. Mr. Cox, if the gentleman from Illinois goes on as he has, a guardian will have to be appointed for him. Right? I mean, that's a direct point-blank threat. Mr. Barksdale addressing Mr. Lovejoy, you shall not come upon this side of the House. Mr. Adrian, to avoid all further difficulty, I suggested the gentleman from Illinois to speak from his seat. We all know him to be a man of courage and that he cannot be intimidated. Mr. Pryor, no one wants to intimidate him. Mr. Lovejoy, nobody can intimidate me. Right? This is how conversations you hear these things all the time. You're not scaring me. Oh, I'm not trying to scare you. All right. Mr. Adrian says, I know, I suggest to the gentleman, he continues speech from the seat, 30 or 40 members from both sides of the House gathered in the area about Mr. Lovejoy and Mr. Pryor, and there was increased confusion. Right, so again, we got 30 or 40 members of the United States House of Representatives up there, very possibly hands on weapons, ready to, burst out into a literal fight. Fist fight, knife fight, gunfight. All right, then there are a couple of procedural motions to try to calm everything down. The chair requests gentlemen to respect the authority of the House and take their seats. Mr. Barksdale, order that black-hearted scoundrel and stealing thief to take his seat, and this side of the House will do it. Right, so the word that I went over there, I am never going to be caught on social media with that one, but it's a certain word that begins with N, right? So we've got Representative Barksdale, a Democrat, screaming at Representative Lovejoy, order that black-hearted scoundrel and slave stealing thief to take his seat. Right, so we're not sitting down until the slave stealer takes his seat. Mind you, it's not the tariff advocate or the nationalism advocate, it's the slave stealer. Everybody has kind of behaved themselves. So Mr. Lovejoy gets back to his subject. I don't know where anybody was standing. Right, so he talks about the Constitution, and he says he loves the Constitution, and that the Constitution does not actually include slavery. And people have been saying, like, how can you be an abolitionist and also support the Constitution? I mean, it's right in there. And he says, no, it isn't. And we can argue about the Constitution, but his spirit is clear. I could take the oath to support the Constitution because I believe in the Constitution, because I hold to it, because my heart is loyal to it. Every part and parcel and portion of it I believe in, but I do not believe in the construction put upon it by those who claim its recognition and sanction of the practice of slaveholding. Mr. Barksdale, no, sir, you stand there today an infamous perjured villain. There are calls to order. Mr. Ashmore, yes, he is a perjured villain, and he perjures himself every hour he occupies a seat on this floor. Renewed calls to order. Mr. Singleton, and a Negro thief to the bargain. At least he was using a slightly more polite term. Mr. Lovejoy continues, he was like, constitutionally we can't do anything about slavery in the states in which it exists, but we absolutely can prevent slavery from extending into the territories. It has been said that he is not loyal to the Constitution. He insists that he is. So, finally, this is kind of what this is for. So he had been advocating a book by a gentleman named Helper, and Helper was actually quite racist, but he wrote a book about how slavery was actually bad for the South, that the South should abolish slavery on its own for its own economic well-being. And this book was widely reviled in the South because people are like, I don't really care about my economic well-being as long as I get to be better than somebody. But Lovejoy was speaking partly from the perspective of someone who had been ferociously attacked for having signed on to this book and said that it was a good idea. So it says, I will sign a recommendation for the circulation of any book that I choose without asking permission of a gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clark, or of any other gentleman in the House or out of the House. I will sign a paper recommending the circulation of the Bible or the Quran, Young Knight's Thoughts or Tom Moore's Anacreon, Jonathan Edwards on the Decrees, or Tom Paine's Age of Reason, just as I please. I claim the privilege as an American citizen of writing my name and recommending the circulation of any and every book without being held amenable to gentlemen upon this floor or anywhere else. That is my answer in regard to it. I have more than that to say. I say nothing about some points in the book. I have no doubt that there is considerable bombast and fustian and violence of language in it because the author was educated in a slave state, and the rhetoric which comes from that quarter is apt to have these characteristics. Laughter. But the philosophy, the gist of the book is what? It is the address of a citizen of a slave state to his fellow citizens in regard to the subject of slavery, recommending in substance the organization of a Republican Party in North Carolina and in all the other slave states. I hope to see that done, and I expect to see it done before very long. You may kill Cassius M. Clay as you threaten to do, but the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You may shed his blood as you shed the blood of my brother on the banks of the Mississippi 20 years ago, and what then? I'm here today, thank God, to vindicate the principle baptized in his blood. You may shed his blood. And what then? A Republican Party will spring up in Kentucky and in all the slave states here along, and these disunionists and gentlemen whom you see so violent now will be displaced by more moderate, and if I may say so without being offensive, more sensible men. I believe in that doctrine. I do not endorse every expression in the Helper book, for I have not studied every expression, but the philosophy of the book, the idea of organizing a party in the slave states is against slavery, I'm in favor of, and I expect to see it accomplished. What is the objection to the book? The objection is that a citizen of the United States, an American citizen, addressed himself to his fellow citizens in a peaceful way through the press, and for this you find fault with him and say that he must be hanged, and that any man who signed a recommendation for the circulation of his book is a blighting, blasting, burning, withering curse, and must not occupy that chair. I want to know if it's come to this. Has not an American citizen a right to speak to an American citizen? I want the right of uttering what I say here in Richmond. I claim the right to say what I say here in Charleston. Mr. Bonham, you'd better try it. Right? Come out here and say it. Mr. Lovejoy replies, yes, sir. I am going to invoke the aid of the general government to protect me as an American citizen and my rights as an American citizen. I can go to England today and in London or anywhere else discuss the question of church and state. I can discuss the question of a monarchical government as compared with a republican form of government. I can do this anywhere in England, but I cannot go into a slave state and open my lips in regard to the question of slavery. Mr. Martin of Virginia, no, we'd hang you higher than Haman. Mr. Lovejoy, I cannot go to a slave state and utter my sentiments to citizens like myself. Mr. Miles, can you go to England and incite the laboring classes to murder the aristocracy or to assassinate the Queen? Mr. Lovejoy, I have no desire to, nor have I any desire to incite such things anywhere else, but I do claim the right of discussing this question of slavery anywhere, on any square foot of American soil over which the stars and stripes float, and to which the privileges and immunities of the Constitution extend. Under that Constitution which guarantees me free speech, I claim it and I demand it. Mr. Bonham, I ask the gentleman why he does not attempt to assert his right. Mr. Lovejoy, yes, sir. The gentleman comes from a slave state in which they are in the habit of speaking of the laboring classes in the northern states as greasy mechanics, filthy operatives, small-fisted farmers, and they jeer at us as worse than the slaves. This insulting language can be and is used in the free states without molestation or injury. We let you come up here and insult us.
Okay, Bob. I'll call before I come over, okay? Or maybe I'll just...
Yet they say, if you come here and utter the sentiments which you sincerely believe, we will hang you. If a mechanic from a free state goes there and utters the sentiment that he thinks, if they had more white laborers and fewer black ones, that labor in the South would be more respectable, what do you do with them? Denude him, scourge him, and to intensify the dignity you drive the knotted throng by the hand of a slave deep in his quivering flesh, then tar and feather him, and then put him on the car still naked to be sent a long distance, and threaten with violence the man who has the compassion to give him a cup of coffee. And finally, after being jeered at every station along the route, this victim of your cruelty, a free citizen, crawls into a stable and stealthily begs, the cast-off clothes of an ostler to hide his nakedness. You drive away young ladies that go to teach school, imprison or exile preachers of the gospel, and pay your debts by raising the mad dog cry of abolition against the agents of your creditors. Mr. Barksdale, the meanest slave in the South is your superior. Cries of order from the Republican side. Mr. Martin of Virginia, I hope gentlemen from the South will let him talk as he pleases, but go away and not listen to him. Mr. Lovejoy continues, Mr. Chairman, I claim the privilege of going anywhere and everywhere within the limits of this American Republic as a free citizen, unmolested, and of uttering in an orderly and legal way any sentiment that I choose to utter, and yet are we allowed to do it? Are we for that in these United States to be subjected to violence, outrage, tar and feathers, burning, imprisonment, and the gallows? Answer that question. I know gentlemen say that self-preservation is the first law of nature, but if you cannot keep slavery and allow free discussion, then I say in God's name, before free discussion and all the rights of free citizens are to be sacrificed to that Moloch of slavery, that Moloch must be immolated at the shrine of liberty, free speech, free discussion, and all those rights that cluster around an American citizen. Why, Mr. Chairman, a citizen of Rome, when the scourge was already upraised and about to fall upon him, if he uttered the cry, I am a Roman citizen, it arrested that scourge. Well, sir, is there not more of a charm? Is it not a prouder position to be an American than to be a Roman citizen? And are we in the 19th century living under this Constitution with our free institutions? Are our persons and our rights to be less sacred than they were under the old Roman administration 18 centuries ago and more? That is my response to the question why I recommended the circulation of the Helper book. We have been at this for quite a while. Nothing changes, and I'm not particularly more excited about threats now in 2020 than he was about threats in 1860.